Hi, Jena Karim. Right. Thanks for coming on to onto the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Zane.
Yeah. I guess I wanted to kind of run down, maybe give like a quick intro for who you are, what you've kind of done, and then maybe then we can kind of jump into some of the questions.
That sounds great.
Yeah. I guess from what I've read and kind of understood, so you've been practicing the topics of like civil society, democracy for the last 20 years. You have an LLM in constitutional law from New York University.
From York University in
Oh,
Canada.
York. Sorry. And then you've MA in Islamic Studies from McGill, and then a BA in American politics from Oberlin. Sorry.
Oberlin, yeah, it's a little
Yeah,
mouthful, but Oberlin, yes.
yeah. And you've also written a book about Islam and like the political culture in Pakistan, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I guess just to kind of get started, since you've had this kind of like journey in both in terms of like democracy reform, societal, civil society, and just kind of like the cultural impacts, what kind of got you started on your journey, and then what kind of where do you think, what part of your journey do you think you're in right now?
Sure. It's a really good, the last part is a really good question, because it's always evolving, right? And I think acknowledging that is really important, so that we don't all get complacent in our practice. So I love that last part. What got me to this point, I think, was just I was always interested in politics. I was always really fascinated by how elite political behavior and how it affected people,
Hmm.
mostly, getting angry at it. And growing up, my parents, like, evening news was a must.
Hmm.
Uh, that was, and then, once we had cable, then it was CNN kind of in a loop. So I was always exposed to newspapers.
Hmm.
Back in the day when we had paper news,
Yeah.
I mean, I still remember the Sunday paper, right?
Hmm.
And the thick Sunday paper, and going through it and asking, my very patient parents the questions that I didn't, what does this mean? What does that mean? And
Hmm.
their answer in typical immigrant parent fashion would be, look it up. And then I would, run to a dictionary. And so it was a lot of the politics was really interesting to me. And then kind of, once I got to Oberlin, and, I was really into American politics, and that was where I wanted to go, because
Hmm.
I liked the sort of the excitement of it. I interned within congressional offices. I interned at the DNC. It was exciting. Then my senior year, 9/11 happened and turned all of my plans on their head, because
Hmm.
I was just thinking, I'm in a unique position here as an American Muslim to kind of say, to bridge this really tremendous gap of understanding. And I think we're seeing it happen again, unfortunately, in the same, possibly even worse way. And it's taking me back to those days. And so that was when I said, American politics can wait. Um,
Hmm.
what I need to do is focus on Islamic studies and understand other Muslim traditions, and
Hmm.
understand where is this gap of understanding coming from? Why is it so hard for any of the sides? And it's not just the two; it's so many sides to this conversation. Why aren't people understanding each other? Why is it that we're all speaking such vastly different languages? And so I decided I wanted to study Islam, and get a very general kind of an understanding of Islam beyond what I personally practiced.
Yeah.
And so that's how that happened. And then I wrote on elite political behavior, and realized that very exciting, very interesting, on, how elites frame religion to their own political ends. And then I realized, I was like, I care a lot more about the people it affects
Hmm.
than the elites themselves. Like, that's what's capturing me. So then, after my master's, I was like, I need to get into civil society work. I need to see what they're doing, what they're on the front lines doing. What does it
Hmm.
mean? What is, you hear civil society a lot, and it's very hard to know what they do, what they are, who they are,
Hmm.
and variations and diversity within.
So
And so
what
that,
does civil society exactly mean?
I was so hoping you wouldn't ask that question. It's such a fascinating question, but it's also, everyone's deeply divided on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, and the specific work that I do on civic engagement, civic advocacy, it's people on the front lines, it's organizations, it can also be individual activists that
Mm-hmm.
are kind of formed in loose collectives, that are on the forefront of either advocating for some kind of policy change or legislative change or social change. It can also be people providing a service to communities, that fills a vacuum that government can't fill, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like food aid or neighborhood groups, neighborhood watch groups, all of that can be civil society. There are
Okay.
links between like community groups and businesses, right? That maybe not obviously, the private sector is not kind of considered civil society. They're considered the sort of antithesis, to civil society, but they're not, because sometimes, very often, they'll assume civil society roles, right? So it's not consistent and it's not straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the easiest way to look at it is people not in governance, right? Not elected, but who work toward a public good, right? In the
Okay.
same way. And whether that public good is, through food aid or programs in their neighborhoods or larger communities or big organizations, or
Mm-hmm.
providing legal advice, to indigent clients or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many ways to kind of conceive of civil society, which is what makes them very exciting, and very interesting, but also very diverse, and it's not a straightforward kind of engagement.
Okay. Yeah. It makes it that's kind of interesting. So I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and it's I think gone through like a just in the period of time I grew up there, so 18 or 20 years or so. Like I felt like it like the volunteer aspect of Memphis was like just the kind of the most unique piece of it, where like the colleges were kind of involved, but they were involved in the sense that um, they were only really there to kind of like assist the community groups that were already kind of existing. And so I guess I never I guess framed it in terms of like civil society, but I guess
Yeah,
it makes sense of like incorporating both like the education piece and then also just the day to day culture in the
absolutely.
city. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you brought up a really important point, which is the notion of volunteerism
Mm-hmm.
and the value of that within civil society. Of course, a lot of civil societies pay. They have to be because of, the nature of the work and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Equally important, equally valid. But so too are volunteers and their part in this notion of civil society. I think that's an excellent point.
So I guess kind of jumping back to what you were talking about with in terms of the journey. So you I guess decided to kind of focus on the civil society, and where did that end up taking you?
Humanitarian assistance, because back then, way back then, um, it was hard in democracy work. It was a little closed off. It was still an emerging field.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't very, it was established, but it was very academic. So you had to have a lot of experience to engage.
Mm-hmm.
So humanitarian assistance offered me the hands to get, the way to get my hands dirty, because they will throw you in the deep end repeatedly, and because the things need to get done, right? No,
Mm-hmm.
there's no choice. There's no, it's is it always life or death? No, but it's pretty significant, right,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of impact to quality of life. And so I knew that I would have the experience of civil society, the experience of engaging with communities very early, but
Mm-hmm.
within an infrastructure that is a little more formalized.
Mm-hmm.
And that was important because that kind of gets you to the next step. For better or worse. I think informal opportunities are super important, and they're super life changing. But professionally, there needed to be a step, because I was still, going up against the usual glass ceilings and the like, and not to put too fine a point on that, but that was the thing. And then after humanitarian assistance, I realized I fell in love with the country, and somehow, through the funniest set of circumstances, wound up taking a language class that then took me to Afghanistan, ultimately, because other language classes that I had prioritized were full, and I
Mm-hmm.
happened to just take Persian, and that opened my life in ways I couldn't imagine. Like, just, it's funny when people tell you that when you're young, that you do one small thing and everything will change. And you're like, no, 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 everything is intentional. Everything that we do is intentional. It's a very global North mentality, right? It's even
Yeah.
probably a very American mentality that if I plan for it, so shall it be. But like, absolutely not. It was the greatest surprise and the greatest, most amazing experience of my life. Was how I discovered Afghanistan through, through humanitarian assistance work, tangentially, but also then through taking Persian classes, engaging with those cultures and traditions just from DC. And then I wound up in Afghanistan, and that was just. Then I wound up doing elections in Afghanistan and civil society development in Afghanistan, and it was just a series of very serendipitous events that led me there, and amazing mentors that guided me. Like, I didn't know much about elections other than sort of the layperson knowledge of elections and electoral practice and electoral reform, but they people teach you, right,
Mhm.
especially as a younger practitioner, and it's tremendous. And that's excuse me, the benefit of being in the field,
Mhm.
is that. And
I I guess, was there a change in I've heard a lot of like horror stories, particularly about like humanitarian assistance, where I guess a community will kind of or a group of people will kind of go in, they'll come up with this kind of like solution, and it turns out the solution doesn't really like address the needs of the population, or
Mhm.
it addresses a need by basically causing another need, right?
100%. I always tell people that you're not a civil society, you're not someone who engages with civil society unless you have been yelled at, cursed at. Um, it's not warm and fuzzy. It's wonderful. It's the best. They're the best people ever on earth, salt of the earth, the most incredibly passionate, amazing, incredible people, intelligent, just incredible. But they will take you down 15 pegs, and they will do it loudly, and they should.
Hmm.
And they should. It also means they trust you, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, no, it's happened throughout my career. In fact, I have been personally, and I try to really emphasize indigeneity in my practice.
Hmm.
Um, and really talk to people, talk less, listen more, right? Is sort of my approach. And then we work on solutions together, right? So the thing that I think I bring to the table is critical thinking. I've had critical thinking education, and I can frame things in certain ways, and they fill it in, right? They're the ones that are doing the work, and they're the ones that are putting in the. It's just for us to say, hey, have you considered things like risk management? Which, to someone that's been living in a sort of a crazy conflict uh, environment, they may not emphasize that, right? Or they, and because it's just their life, they're used to it.
Hmm.
And so to come back and say, maybe we can do some, XYZ, and then they're like, oh, this is a great idea, right? Again, not imposing, just suggesting,
Hmm.
but suggesting it with a sense of, with the backing of evidence, right? And
Hmm.
also, it's why we get educated. It's why we get educated, because once you say that you're educated, that gives you a little bit of credibility, or a lot of credibility, particularly as a woman. It's a very critical ingredient to this. But yeah, I mean, there are definitely people who came in. I've heard so many horror stories from Afghanistan where, I mean, it was humanitarian assistance, also democracy work. It doesn't change. Um, and I think the best way we all learned to shift and course correct was to listen to the communities, and not be sort of, like, flabbergasted by their reaction, but to say, okay,
Hmm.
no, you know what? They said this wasn't going to work. This bridge isn't sustainable. So what
Hmm.
are we going to, the question is now not to dwell on, not to immediately dwell on what went wrong, because you have to reflect on it and why
Hmm.
it happened, but to say, okay, how are we going to fix it, and where are we going to get the money to fix it?
Hmm.
And what does that mean, right? And I think, again, global north, we're used to high tech solutions. The more expensive the better. Absolutely not in a lot of countries. And no matter what, if you're doing humanitarian assistance, if you're doing elections,
Hmm.
everyone will always say throwing money at the problem rarely fixes it, right? You have to be intentional in your approach and talk to the people whom it's affecting,
Hmm.
the problem, or even the problem and the solution, arguably, and then come up with things that will work together, on their terms, not ours.
So what does doing elections exactly mean? So is it like helping conduct like the actual like boots on the ground, like election booths, or?
So we have to be careful in that, because then that people then think that we are influencing the elections because,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it, the time I was working on elections, we were funded by governments, by bilaterals.
Mm-hmm.
So what does it mean? It's a very important question. There's so many dimensions to it.
Mm-hmm.
That alone would be a whole set of episodes. So I'll promise you I'll keep it brief, but it's things like anything from working with civil society on election
Mm-hmm.
reform, before an election law goes
Mm-hmm.
into parliament or is discussed in parliament for civil society, they usually do a consultation or two with civil society groups.
Mm-hmm.
So it's to prepare civil society groups for that, right? Because elections are very technical.
Yeah.
They're very math driven, and that scares everybody who isn't
Mm-hmm.
a math person, myself included. I mean, I remember having to do electoral math, and I was like, didn't sign up for this. This is so hard, and it's very complicated and sometimes overwrought, arguably. But like, so sometimes it's helping civil society in a very neutral way say, okay, this is what Parliament is discussing, and these are the implications on your constituents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And add to that, right? Just to say, this is what we think the impacts are, but you tell us, so that we can kind of say, okay, this is where you want to go, and then facilitating opportunities for them to come together is, I think, the most important thing, and then coming up with recommendations and how to advocate for change. So that's one element. The other element is actually supporting election commissions, like, election workers, poll workers, training them. It's not to actually conduct them, but it's to enable their conduct and their administration,
Okay,
essentially.
that makes sense. And kind of, I guess, jumping back to somewhat of a side comment that you made a couple seconds or a couple minutes ago about, like, I guess being a woman going into Afghanistan. Like, I grew up in the United States, so I have the perception that I have of Afghanistan is one that there is, I guess, a little bit of one of where I guess the rights of women seem somewhat muted. And I guess how was that experience?
So when I was there, so now it's under the Taliban,
Mm-hmm.
again. And so it's a very different environment from when I was there under the
Mm-hmm.
Republic. Under the Islamic Republic, yeah, it was hard. But
Mm-hmm.
under the Taliban, it's much worse, right? Women don't have access to education after the sixth grade. It's an extreme of extremes.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, and there are a lot of women advocates that are fighting for that, right? And the workarounds are something special. But for me personally, oh, it was such a time of privilege. I mean, with Afghans, no, it was great with Afghans because they look at me like a sister, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm half Pakistani, half Indian,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'm familiar to
Yeah.
them. I was familiar to folks, and I wanted that. We kind of created a natural warmth through language and culture and the cultural similarities,
Mm-hmm.
and so that rapport was very clear. And but I was also coming from, I was I was in the car with the folks from the United States, right? So that gave
Mm-hmm.
me a different type of credibility. So I would argue I had more privilege than anyone coming into Afghanistan because I had the rapport with a lot
Mm-hmm.
of, I mean, and they were just, my friends laugh at me because I will always, they will have such a place in my soul. They taught me so much. Everybody I met in Afghanistan taught me about kindness, about strength and resilience, even though no one should, no one chooses resilience, but
Mm-hmm.
how they adapt to their circumstances and how no one should ever have to adapt like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they taught me about poetry, about elections, all in the same day, right? So they were tremendous. Because I was educated, that put me in a very different category because I was still Muslim, and they were
Mm-hmm.
like, "You might not be the same kind of Muslim, but you're not so different that we can't engage with you and tell you the honest truth about what's happening."
Yeah.
And so I can only count one time in the 5 years I lived there where I had an iffy experience because of gender. Um, the gender issues I'm talking about, unfortunately, are, here,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's and
Yeah.
it's getting a little bit better. And it's getting a little bit better. And it's also, I'm older, right? So I'm in a different career space. The generations shift. God bless Gen Z for blasting all the doors open for everybody, and I really mean that. They're courageous in a way that I wish we had been when we were their age. Um, but everyone kind of, everyone builds on the previous generation. So hopefully that's what happened here. But Yeah, no, the gender issues were also, I'm also a 5 foot tall brown woman. So, you know, there was getting taken seriously, and also people making assumptions about my background, or what I could offer.
Yeah.
It took a lot. I was grateful that my parents made me do debate so that I
Mhm.
could, talk and
Yeah.
engage on, and again, it was always about code switching. It was about a lot of code switching, which in one way you're willing to do, in another way it's a little bit more sort of irritating to do.
So you, I guess, ended up going to Afghanistan, but you've kind of been in a multitude of countries since then, right?
Yes. I just got back from Armenia, went to Tajikistan. Tajikistan was kind of my first time in the field.
Hmm.
And again, just incredible people and people willing to teach. That's how I learned how to engage with communities, was
Hmm.
Tajikistan actually. Um,
Yeah.
and how I learned,
Why was that environment unique in that regards?
because I had never done it. I was, in my
Okay.
20s,
Hmm.
and getting thrown into like community discussions, which get very intense.
Hmm.
And dealing with languages I didn't speak, I didn't understand. And I will tell you, the most pivotal question of my life was asked to me by a Palmyri.
Hmm.
And it was a question that a 24-year-old wasn't equipped to answer. Not certainly not a 24-year-old, not this 24-year-old from the United States. And I was reading I was reading my Intro to Persian book, and like very proud of myself for learning this language, right? And I was very, in your 20s, so it's a different attitude and mentality. And I wish for everyone that time before life humbles you, because it's amazing. um but I was reading the book, and this driver came up to me. Our flight got delayed, so I was sitting outside, and this outside of the airport with a driver, a couple of drivers, a couple of us were in a kind of convoy together. And he asked me, he looked at me, he's like, "Oh, you're American?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "But I'm trying to learn this beautiful language." And I was, putting on a little bit of a show with that. And he said, like, "Well, let me ask you a question." And he said, "Why are you guys blessed and why are we cursed?" And I was like, "Oh my God."
Yeah.
It just spun me. I mean, nothing was the same after that. Nothing was the same after that, because it was the most important question of my life. And it's a question I continue to ask myself, but it's also not focusing on understanding, that which is unseen, but it's
Hmm.
understanding that what is our responsibility relative to one another. And
Yeah.
that's what kind of walked away with. I said, well, I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did.
Hmm.
Um, you know, uh, Colonialism, war, conflict, but I don't know why you were chosen for that and I wasn't.
Yeah.
To this, obviously, to the same extent, by any stretch. Um, and I just remember looking at him and I said, well, all I can say to you is that that will be my purpose, is to kind of bridge that gap. And
Hmm.
that's the best kind of that I can do, as an individual, and really focus on what you all want and need. And that's what changed my whole view of communities. That was to your question about imposing a view or imposing a model or imposing a strategy. That's
Hmm.
what changed it, right? Because I said we have to listen more, talk less, and then we can use the benefit, of critical thinking and all of that, to jointly come up with a solution and not impose a solution,
Hmm.
on their kind and their priorities, not our priorities for them, which gets tricky, which gets really tricky.
That's I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's one that like so being a Muslim and being I'm an Ismaili Muslim in particular, and one of the things that I've like kind of struggled with as I got particularly as I like got older was like I look out into like the world and I see that like the places of conflict seem to be the areas that have Muslims in them, or at least that's the ones that I feel like get portrayed the most on media. And then also, you hear debates with like Sam Harris that says that maybe the like core values of Islam have issues with them, or um, and then I guess I see like the good parts on my like day to day life, and I can see like the aspect of like charity and volunteerism and like organizations like the Aga Khan Network and the good that they're doing. But then it feels like when I look at the broader world, it's hard for me to sometimes like reconcile why that difference is there.
There are so many reasons for that. I will start with the one that plagues me the most is that nationalism of any sort will
Mm-hmm.
get everyone into trouble, whether it's in Islam, Christianity, Judaism, anything,
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism, any faith that starts out peaceful and focused on social justice and collective, communal support, interdependence. All of these values are shared by every faith,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and then but when you nationalize and you put in power and acquisition of power into the equation, everyone gets into trouble. I mean, even Buddhism, right, which you don't think of in that way, but when it's nationalized, falls prey to, I mean, humans fall prey to that in a political setting, right? And that's what happens. It becomes, it's not the faith that's the problem, it's how people use the faith that becomes the problem. I mean, it is an absurd notion to me that women cannot be educated because of that is false. I mean, one doesn't even need to be a scholar of Sharia to come up with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just useful because nobody, it seems esoteric, right? People
Yeah.
don't understand it, so they're like, "Oh, well, let's blame that." No, it's foolishness, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's how things are interpreted for political gain and for social
Yeah.
gain and financial gain that gets them to the point of depravity, autocracy, and coercive governance. But on their face, and I know it's frustrating. It's frustrating as a Muslim to see it.
Mm-hmm.
It's frustrating to even be in that environment and sometimes have to convince people
Mm-hmm.
of things, and you're like, that doesn't make sense. And then you realize quickly that you're just dealing with a political game, but it's just got a different face on it. Do you think that it's different here, in the US, where, I mean, I imagine if I were someone who is an devout Christian here, and I have
Mm-hmm.
interacted with a lot of devout Christians. I mean, I live in Texas, so, it's not hard to come by. Their notion of charity is tremendous.
Yeah.
Like, every time, like when there were storms here, and how much neighbors came together to help
Mm-hmm.
each other out, clean up debris and all of that, and
Yeah.
they were devout Christians, and that's their ethos, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so for them to, and we got to talking, and they were saying, it's sort of like these people don't represent our values,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're not doing it for our values, so any faith falls prey
Yeah.
to this, including Islam, including Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, every faith, no matter what. And so any kind of theocracy is going to lead you down a path of you know, it, anytime power and faith come together, it's easy because faith is an easy compulsion for people. So
Yeah.
you can get people to engage with you on the basis of faith
Mm-hmm.
very easy. It's a very convenient tool for coercion, unfortunately.
Yeah, I have like sometimes wondered, just kind of going back to like the blessed versus cursed comment. Like it kind of feels like a lot of like if you look at the United States, we had the like Make America Great Again movement, right? If you I think if you look at like the Muslim world, maybe I think there's I think at least from conversations that I've had, it sometimes feels like there's a push to like go back to when like Islam was part of like the great empires, right? And it and I and granted, maybe I'm not necessarily well educated to speak on this, but from what I've like seen on the media, it seems like Europe is kind of going through a similar thing where like they want to kind of go back to like kind of nostalgic times where they felt like they were in much better straits. And so it kind of feels like everyone's chasing this like height that may or may not necessarily have existed, right?
100%. 100%. And think of who had power, right? Like when
Yeah.
we look at making America great again, they want to
Hmm.
harken back to the 50s. Who had power in the 50s? Who didn't have power in the 50s?
Yeah.
Right? It's an everyone is freaking out because of demographic shifts, I
Hmm.
think.
Yeah.
I think you're right that it's harkening back to an era that may or may not have existed in the way that it's been memorialized in television shows.
Hmm.
I mean, good Lord, was Leave It to Beaver real? I mean, it's sort of like in 20 years when people watch Friends, are they going to think that everyone lived that way in New York in the 90s? Absolutely not. Like it's,
Yeah.
there's a fantasy element to how things are memorialized, and then you also have the compounded issue of history is written by the victor,
Hmm.
and colonialism definitely is compelling to some people. It's extremely compelling to some people, and it's very, deeply troubling to those that it hurts. And so is true of capitalism. So I think that's a very important point, that we're all just trying. Everyone is trying to go back to a place where they felt safe
Hmm.
and they didn't feel like they were going to be compromised. And I think human beings have a scarcity mindset that
Hmm.
ultimately just gets us into so much trouble, that we think that if everything is zero sum, if my neighbor has some kind of authority, it means I don't have that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a difficult way to live.
Mhm. So going, I guess, with all of those like challenges, where do you see the world kind of, or like, I guess maybe particularly in like civil society headed in the next like decade or so?
So I'm very optimistic about civil society always, because I've
Hmm.
engaged with them and they are fighters to the end.
Hmm.
Um, they have a lot going against them. The
Hmm.
tides of nationalism, the tides of disinformation, misinformation, of autocracy, authoritarianism, and coercive governance, of far right movements,
Hmm.
these are tidal waves for civil society groups. I think the important thing is that we keep investing in them,
Hmm.
investing in their work, and understanding what their needs are and how we can support them.
Hmm.
Whether it's through technical assistance, whether it's through financial support, whether it's through providing educational opportunities, all of it. There's so many ways to do it. So I think that they have a greater kind of knowledge of of things as time has gone on, because again, they're building off of previous generations of civil society.
Hmm.
So I'm very optimistic. I think that they will fight. I think that they will fight through educating people, through civic engagement, through voting, through encouraging other people to vote, through actually putting up candidates and holding
Hmm.
them accountable, for what they do. But, I also think that they're up against things that are going to be very difficult. Um, and it's going to be a challenge. It's not going to be an easy set of fights, but they are incredible. And what was it? Was it John Lewis who said, or Martin Luther King Jr., or kind of the collective civil rights movement? The notion is that the fight for rights is generational.
Hmm.
It's not one and done, right? It's not one and done. And so too do I think civil society groups everywhere are keenly aware of this fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, or one of like the fears that I have is just the way that like the technological world is kind of headed, right? Like I kind of feel like it's in terms of like the like protest side. I think protesting has like somewhat become easier and harder at the same time,
Oh,
and then
100%.
with like the advent of like AI and like the ease of access to social media, and like the, I guess, I heard on the news that there was a psyops campaign to get people to not take the vaccine in certain parts of the world, right?
Yep.
When COVID was kind of running rampant, or potentially still is running rampant, but so with all those like pieces, the way that like technology is kind of like emerging, and the way that like, I guess, very powerful groups are kind of using it, that kind of makes me scared about the way that people kind of help each other in the long run.
I completely agree with you. And the protesting, you're right, because now with facial recognition,
Hmm.
it's like the greater the challenge, the higher the fence,
Yeah.
that's built, right? And so ultimately, there's going to be a point at which that we have to stop.
Hmm.
Um, so I have my best friend. I have to put in a sort of a plug, because I think the work she's doing is amazing. I don't fully understand it because I'm not a tech person, um, but you know, a lot of what she does is AI for social good.
Mhm.
So building off of that, I think one thing civil society practitioners and DRG practitioners like me need to focus on, because we're all very scared of technology. We
Mhm.
think an iPad is like the height of like engagement. I mean, there are people who focus on technology in elections, and they're a different caliber. They're amazing. They speak in a language that we don't understand, and it's very funny. And I'm sad that I'm now old enough to be in that category of people who don't understand. But I think for us to draw from the tech sector on the social good, on
Mhm.
people like, my closest friend that are working on things like AI for social good and turning it on its head, and
Mhm.
to really understand what that means, right? How is AI going to actually help civil society? How is it going to contribute to their efforts, right? How is it
Mhm.
going to make knowledge more accessible to people that live in places where there is still low bandwidth internet?
Yeah.
Internet penetration is, getting better every day,
Mhm.
but it's still not perfect. I mean, even a place like Armenia, which is very
Mhm.
developed, is only 78%,
Mhm.
right? Which is, so imagine that countries in more dire straits would
Mhm.
not have that. So it's, I think that we can learn and leverage from the tech sector to understand how to flip it, how to
Yeah.
turn it on its head to actually benefit, whether it's, my immediate thought is access to knowledge or dismantling disinformation through
Mhm.
AI, right? Using AI to dismantle instead of um, encourage disinformation or enable disinformation. It maybe at some point someone much smarter than me can figure out a way to help it filter disinformation and
Yeah.
misinformation, right? For it to actually be used to counter the psyops on things like
Mhm.
vaccines or literacy, or which is a big one, which is a
Mhm.
big one. So things like that. I think that she's taught me that this can actually be a tool for good, because we're very scared of it. And
Yeah.
in my sector, I'm generalizing a lot. There are people who aren't, and they're teaching us a lot about how not to be scared. But I think we can leverage from the tech sector the benefits and how it can be leveraged.
Yeah. I guess with like I, I wonder I am very like skeptical on like the ability for AI to like filter out like disinformation in particular, right? And I feel like it's something that like even I've noticed myself, like I'll find something out and I'll have held something as a belief for, you know, 5, 6 plus years and then find out like that it potentially may not have been true, right? And even with like I use chat gpt a lot for my work, and then I've like definitely like if I was someone that was a little bit newer to the job, right, there would definitely be things that I would ask chat gpt and it would just give me like the wrong answer, and I would never be able to like
Right,
be able to tell that what I was given was wrong, right?
right.
And
I think that's a very important point. I think there's a notion of trust but verify that we
yeah.
have to just live with, right?
Yeah.
Even the written word,
Mhm.
even when it comes from humans, right? Obviously, like we took things like, I say we, like 100 years old when I used to use Encyclopedia Britannica and all that sort of stuff. We
Yeah.
took it as like the word or something in the
Right.
newspaper. We were like,
Yeah.
oh, it must be true, right?
Yeah.
It's the technological aspect is certainly new,
Mhm.
and different, and accelerating the process, but it was also what our mindset was. And I think understanding that when you receive a piece of information, it's very important to verify it, to study
Mhm.
it. Getting people to want to do that in the busyness of their daily lives, I think, is the greatest challenge of all, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah, I remember growing up. I was like my like RAC, or like I guess what the equivalent of like Sunday school would be. Teachers would always tell me that Al Jaber was the one that invented algebra instead of saying Al Khwarizmi, right? And it was just something that like everyone just accepted out of like the maybe like 100 or so kids that were around, right?
Right.
But
I think
that
it's,
kind of
it's interesting. Yeah.
and it just starts at an early age, and I think it becomes harder to like to I guess get rid of like false beliefs the younger they come in, right?
100%. In fact, that's such a good point. What country? It's a. Oh, I think I want to say it's Finland, but I could be wrong. So whoever's listening to it, please look it up. I'm I don't want to take responsibility for promoting misinformation, ironically. Um, I think it is Finland or Iceland, one of the two. They're starting to teach kids in at a very early age. It's like kindergarten, even, or some approximation of kindergarten. It might even be younger.
Mhm.
So essentially, how to filter out misinformation and disinformation at that age,
Oh wow.
just naturally. It was
Yeah.
such an exciting thing, and it was reported like once on NPR, and then I never saw it. And so I was thinking about that actually just a few days ago, and I was thinking, how do we make that for, I mean, I know that there's a lot of resources for adult
Yeah.
learners on that, but they're starting them young, and I think the intention needs to be there. But
Yeah.
for sure, and that's not going to happen in many places, right? It's
Mhm.
the Nordic countries, and those places have a very different and wonderful way of being, that it's different.
Yeah.
um but I think you're right that it needs to start early. In terms of responding to that, needs to start early. That's a very good point.
Is for people that are kind of coming up at that might be in high school right now or early stages of college. Do you have any advice for them that you would say, hey, these are the things that you should focus on if you want to end up like working in democracy reform or civil society or
100%. Lots of advice. I think first and foremost, focusing on learning foreign languages, critically important. It, you're not going to be a translator. You're not going to be an interpreter. I mean, unless that's what you want to be, and that's wonderful and very important. But if you want to focus on this work, it's not about that. It's kind of what Nelson Mandela said, right? You get through to someone's soul with their language. That opens up all the doors. And there are very many countries you can't go to or engage with without language facility, you
Mhm.
know. And so I think at that level, at high school level, where you have access to language study, that's easier. And you have the brain to take on languages. It's much easier. It's harder as an adult. It really is, for a variety of reasons, not just because of your brain and processing languages, but it's also you're just different, busier, working harder to do. Learning languages and focusing on that, engaging with cultures and immersing in cultures.
Mhm.
And this I understand is a privileged thing. Not most people don't have access to that. So even starting within your own communities and understanding what cultures engage in your own communities, fairs, cultural events, all of that stuff. If you're in high school, engage, volunteer, learn, build relationships with people that are 100% different than you, who grew
Mhm.
up completely different than you. Find opportunities, seek opportunities, because that will serve you well. Um, I think that, and then if in college you have the ability to go abroad, and I accept that the privilege involved in that is significant.
Mhm.
Do it though. Find opportunities, find funding. I mean, there are ways to do it. The more you can engage globally by being in those places, and places that are a little bit different, right? That are scary, that
Yeah.
are not. I mean, I'm not saying go where you're ducking bombs right away. I wouldn't recommend that for someone in high school. Sorry, parents. But when I mean scary, I mean different to a point where you're not going to learn the language and you have to kind of figure it out. You
Mhm.
know, I've been in really funny, awkward situations. I mean, just every situation was awkward. And it's good because it kind of breaks down your bias.
Mhm.
It kind of forces you to engage with people in ways that you didn't think you could.
Yeah.
Um, and I think those sorts of experiences, formative experiences at that stage, at high school and college, are very important. Also, become a debater. I cannot stress that enough. It because the ability to think and talk on your feet,
Mhm.
for any sector, for anything that you do in your life, will be
Yeah.
very, very important.
Yeah. The piece about just kind of going and putting yourself in places that are scary is really interesting. Like I have I've like I guess worked across a bunch of different like sectors like from physics to aerospace to insurance. And one of the things that I always kind of notice is that you would always have like a set of like, and this is particularly from like the immigrant perspective, but you would have a set of people that came in. They would kind of stick to the people that were kind of most similar to them, and they seemed to have the like most trouble like adapting to the like environment that they were in, right? But
100%.
there was another set of people. Like I remember a coworker when I was like 25 or 26. She had worked in companies that were primarily of Latin American descent. She worked for another company that was primarily of Japanese descent, and she ended up knowing, like, could have conversational fluency in the languages that she like of the
That's
people that she like connected with, right? And I
so
think,
on.
and it's because she put herself out there, right? She could have easily just been like, I'm just gonna go to work, go home, only interact with the friends that I already have, right?
100%. I mean, and that takes courage
Yeah.
because it's scary, especially when you're younger. It's scary. I mean, scary as an adult too. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't get less scary. It just, you learn how to do it better.
Yeah.
But it's always when I had to go. I mean, I went to Armenia, and that was the first time I'd ever been there.
Hmm.
And this was, just a couple weeks ago. And, and I
Yeah.
was like, I wonder if they'll like me. You know what I mean? Like, you still have those sorts of thoughts,
Yeah.
and sort of how are you going to engage with people who are so different, who have different conflict history, and all of that. But I love that you're a friend of that. And I love that, that it takes a great deal of courage, no matter how confident you are or aren't, or introverted or shy or whatever it is that people are kind of working through at a younger stage of life.
Yeah.
And even arguably as older adults, again, we learn the workarounds. We don't always blast through it. We just learn how to get around it. But for her to do that, I think is exceptional. And one point, though, I do want to make is that if you do have a sense of community, rely on that community for support. I mean,
Hmm.
don't just engage with that community and don't just stick within it,
Hmm.
and do what's comfortable. But certainly making contributions to your own community is also what allows pluralism to thrive, right?
Yeah.
So it's balancing kind of both. But to your point, yeah, but yeah, don't only just develop relationships in that one group, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
And I guess kind of back to you. What are your goals for the next like stage of your life?
Well, I think first and foremost, I really want to finish this. I started a PhD program a few years ago, and
Hmm.
so I really, really want to finish that. It is, it is something interesting to pursue degrees after a certain age because you do get
Hmm.
complacent.
Yeah.
I was certainly complacent, and it was just, but then I just did it
Hmm.
because someone inspired me to do it, and because I saw
Yeah.
someone else doing it
Hmm.
at that stage of life, and I thought, you know what, I'm seeing how they're growing and learning and excited about it, but I'm also seeing how difficult it is. So hopefully that'll happen. Fingers crossed. Um, but that, and I think I want to focus a lot more on you know, in addition to the work that I do in the practitioner stuff, engaging with civil societies, engaging with governing institutions, and now more with judicial institutions, because my focus has kind of gone into rule of law
Hmm.
over the last 10 years.
Yeah. The
Um,
PhD is
it's
in
in
law,
law.
right?
It's
Yeah.
in law. Yeah. Yeah. And and my focus on constitutional law in particular, and kind of how constitutions enable certain types of governance that are, inclusive governance, really.
Hmm.
Um, One thing that I do want to focus on now, because I think I'm at that age, is more on you know who I can who I can help here
Hmm.
get into these types of roles. I was very lucky. I had a lot of, I mean, so many serendipitous events that allowed me to do things, and there were lots of failures along the way. Lots of failures along the way, continue to be, but that's part of life, and we embrace and we're lucky that we're in a time now where we get to embrace failure, and try to learn and grow from it, as opposed to stay stuck in that sort of psychological space of
Yeah. I mean,
negative.
at least with like my career, I think even like the things that I like regretted in the moment, like now that I'm like I look back on them, I don't think I necessarily regret any of them.
100%. 100%. Like the roads not traveled sometimes were not the roads for us.
Yeah.
Like for whatever reason, things happened, or we thought that that was what the path we were supposed to take. That's another thing. Oh my gosh, for young people, you
Hmm.
think you're going to have this plan, and you're going to plan 5 million times in your life. Be
Yeah.
ready to pivot. Be ready to pivot. Have a structure, have a path or set of paths in your mind, but
Mm-hmm.
just understand that pivoting, it makes life exciting. Adjusting, adapting, it actually is so wonderful to do that. Not for reasons that are difficult. I mean, we've had to do that too, and that's not, I'm not going to sugarcoat that. That's horrible and difficult and painful. But ultimately, you come out stronger and better and more, wiser for having had the experience. Although it's excruciating to go through it,
Mm-hmm.
but there are definitely moments where you don't think, like when I was in my 20s, I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do, XYZ ABC, and it's like 1 2 12 35 62 Z B, that's how life is. And it's embracing that, and to know that you have to have a path, but the path might change, and embrace that. Embrace the forks in the road. um Sorry, can you repeat the initial question that just popped into my head, and I wanted to make sure I mentioned that.
Um, oh, what are your goals for the next stage of your life?
So I think, in addition to the PhD, I really want to focus on what I can do to help younger people, especially younger people that are, first generation immigrants, and all of that. I think that they have so much value to add to development,
Mm-hmm.
because they understand, they know, and other people of color, women, marginalized groups, those who are disabled that maybe don't see an in
Mm-hmm.
into these sectors. I think that their input is just absolutely invaluable, and it's missing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's missing. I've seen a lot of people talk about disabilities and elections, or disabilities and civic engagement, who don't understand what it is to have a disability,
Yeah.
right? And so that perspective is not just a perspective, it is central to kind of how we would engage with a topic like that, right? There's no substitute for lived experience. And so really trying to do what I can to kind of, you know, climb up the ladder, but always have a hand to see, to help someone do that as well. And focus on teaching and those sorts of things that would accomplish that as well. So we'll see how it all pans out.
Yeah. I guess, do you have any like I guess final comments you want to give the audience, or anything that you kind of like to share about governance or civil society or the world today?
Sure. No matter how depraved things are, no matter how depraved things seem, and they are, right? It's not great. The world is on fire, literally, figuratively, all the ways. The one thing that would accelerate the depravity is to be despondent. We have to engage. We have to fight. And it's not, I don't mean fight in sort of a negative way. I mean engaging, at any level,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's even within your neighborhood, with an individual, whatever it is. And it doesn't have to be democracy and governance. I love that. That's my way, right? But I'm saying in general, to fight the depravity, yes, big systemic changes are necessary,
Mm-hmm.
and working on that and contributing to that is important. But so too does that start at a micro level, right? It's all of it. So don't the response to depravity is not to wring our hands and say that, okay, well, it's not going to work, and we might as well just, wait for the wave of hell to fall upon us. Like, we need to participate and engage and keep on keeping on, because there's a significant value. That's how things change, right? That's how social change happens.
Well, thank you, Jenna. This conversation was absolutely amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. Likewise. It's so wonderful that you're doing these sessions.